Mukesh Kapila is the professor of global health and humanitarian affairs at the University of Manchester. He joins me now live from Geneva. Thanks for being with us. I actually want to start with a bigger issue here, because pharmaceutical companies are mostly, private industries that take pretty big risks doing research and development. It's very expensive. And as a commercial enterprise, they actually have the right to sell to the highest bidder to recoup their losses. I mean, is that fair, that practice? Is it fair during a pandemic?
I think it's fair for a pharmaceutical company to get a return on its investment and have the motivation to carry on doing research. Now, whether or not we are in a pandemic actually is not an argument, a special argument, because the fact is that these drugs are needed, and they're needed before pandemics, during pandemics, and after pandemics. So in that sense, I think the company is only doing what its systems and the international rules allow it to do.
Absolutely, but that means that people with less money that don't live in the wealthiest country on the planet cannot get drugs that would potentially save their lives.
That's absolutely true. And the fact that the United States authorities have commandeered the total supplies from Gilead for the next couple of months actually doesn't bode very well for the rest of the world. However, there is an arrangement with an Indian supplier to produce the drug in generic, as a generic variation of the drug. And also, under the intellectual property rights, the Doha Agreement, the TRIPS agreement, it allows countries that are in emergency to do compulsory registration and to be able to, therefore, to make or buy the drug from elsewhere. And we have seen that happen with HIV and AIDS drugs in the past and even now. So I think while what the US is doing doesn't send a very good signal in terms of solidarity with the rest of the world, but the fact is this is mitigated to some extent by, as WHO have said, well, it's great to have a drug that reduces your stay in hospitals, but this is hardly a game changer for the rest of the world. Of course, in the US, which has the most expensive healthcare system in the world, it makes sense to save a few $1,000s by getting out of hospital early. And they're in the middle of a massive epidemic. They're the world's center for the epidemic. So I can see it makes sense for them. But quite honestly, if you are in Africa, if you are in some of the poorer developing countries, the use of this drug is hardly a major advance in terms of the management of COVID-19. So I say this not as some kind of mitigation or to kind of excuse the U.S. strategy, but just to say that that these drugs are still at a very early stage. Once we know more how remdesivir is used in practice and whether it actually reduces infectivity, for example, the risk to spread the virus to others, then we might be in a better position to be able to say whether or not this is actually a useful drug in terms of the worldwide pandemic control effort. Until then, we don't need to get too agitated about it for the moment.
Fair enough, but I mean, in the bigger picture here, you're saying, generic drugs can actually provide a solution here. They can be produced in, India quite easily. The problem is these larger pharmaceuticals hold these patents. They don't necessarily have to give up the right to those patents to any generic drug maker. It becomes a pretty big fight under international law, often when they do have to give up their patents. Is there a way, especially in light of a pandemic that's taken 500,000 lives and crippled the global economy, might we have to look at changes to the way pharmaceuticals can be reproduced now across the planet during times of crisis?
Indeed. I think when the current regulations governing pharmaceuticals were agreed many years ago, we didn't anticipate such a dangerous pandemic. And there are moves already to be looking at amendments to that. However, it is open to governments even now to go for compulsory registration. So, a company may own a patent, like Gilead does for remdesivir. However, the governments can still license the production with or without the consent of the patent holder. Now, the developed countries, European countries, for example, the UK, Germany, France, and so on, they would be reluctant to do this because you have to remember that the Western countries, like the ones I mentioned, the British, the French, the Germans, they are amongst the most profitable beneficiaries of the current system. After all, it's their companies, their big pharma companies that make a lot of money. So before the Western world goes against their own pharma companies and kind of shoot themselves in the foot, they're going to be very reluctant to go against the pharma companies. So I think it's important to understand that it's not just the country's pharma companies that you might classify as being opportune and unreasonable. The governments that back the pharma sector, especially in the Western world, it's not in their interest to actually overturn the current pharma system on which they make a lot of money.
Okay. Mukesh Kapila, thank you so much for sharing your insight. We appreciate it.